The levels are set. The mics are ready.
Testing, 1, 2, 3.
So strap yourself in. It's time to go one-on-one with Bill Alexander.
Let's go.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to this edition of One-on-One with Bill Alexander. Glad you could join us today. Today, we have a very interesting guest, and we're going to be talking about his new book called Raising LGBTQ Allies. Now, I could read all his bio information, but instead of doing that, let me have him do that for you. Chris Tompkins is with me. Chris, say hi to my audience.
Hi, Bill. Hi, audience. It's good to be here. I'm grateful for the opportunity.
Now, can you explain to my audience who you are and what this book is about?
Yeah. So, really, I'm an uncle. I'm a teacher. That's kind of what I really consider myself as a teacher. I've been teaching social emotional learning in Los Angeles for the past 6 years or so. I'm also an LGBTQ advocate and life coach as well. And so really this book was from my own journey, my own life, my own experience with my family. I don't know if you want to jump in, but I can kind of tell you the background, how it got started.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you about, because the book is actually very eye-opening. And the reason I say that, and for the audience, that's what the book looks like. The reason I say that is because when I was reading it, I thought that I was, maybe I'll use the word progressive when it comes to these types of issues and stuff like that. And then I'm starting to thinking about going, wait a minute, maybe I'm not. Maybe because of the way I was raised, because I grew up in the 70s is when I went to elementary school. And some of the things you talk about, we didn't think anything of because it wasn't brought out into the forefront. And then I keep reading it and I see that you're at a family gathering, and you have a nephew who's 6 years old at the time, and asked you about a friend you were with and said, "Is that your girlfriend?" The rest of the room just brushed it off, but then you started to feel uncomfortable. Why is that?
Yeah, because it caught me off guard because I was really surprised by the question. I just really kind of assumed that he knew that I was gay because, like you mentioned, he was 6 at the time, and so I had been out of the closet his entire life, and so I didn't really think, like, I just kind of assumed that. I'm from Arizona, so I live in Los Angeles, but I was home in Arizona visiting, so I guess I just kind of thought that my brother and sister were having those conversations, and so then that's when I started to ask around to parents and caregivers, people I know who had kids after he asked my nephew asked me that question. And I was really surprised by some of the answers that I got. Parents who are really supportive, people who were loving friends of mine were like, I thought about it. I just didn't know how to bring it up, or I didn't know what to say. And so I was like, oh, wow. So that's what really led me on this journey of uncovering the nuances of homophobia and what I call the messages from the playground.
Because what I think is really interesting, and like I said, I was born in the mid 60s, so I'm 55 right now. And growing up in the 70s and the 80s, we really didn't see too much of that. And I don't want to say in everyday life because, and I hate to use this word, but it wasn't acceptable to be out at the time. And we didn't see it in our daily viewing on TV and stuff like that. Not until probably the late 80s. I'm thinking of the Ellen Show, Roseanne, when she kissed Mariel Hemingway, and you start looking at it being introduced that way. And the more it's being introduced in our media, the more acceptable it's become up until we are today, because people are able to view it and not think much of it anymore. When you came out of the closet, how difficult was that?
It was difficult. My story. So I mentioned I'm an LGBTQ advocate. So one of the organizations I volunteer with is PFLAG. So for your listeners or for yourself, if you're not aware, so PFLAG is for parents and families of LGBTQ people. And so they we basically go into schools, we go into businesses, companies will have us come in and we speak on panels. And so they usually like to have someone from the L, the G, the B, just to kind of for representation. And each of us shares our coming out story, like a quick kind of 5-minute version. And then we open it up to questions. And so what I often share is that my coming out story includes religious. So I have a religious kind of background.
Okay.
And so religious trauma is part of my story. So when I answer your question and say how difficult it was difficult,
right,
because I had that kind of religious component to it. The thing of it is, though, is that, like I said, I've been teaching for the past 6 years all over Los Angeles County. And what's been really this book kind of came together from my own experience and also my experience of being in the classroom and working with young people. Because what I realized is, as far as we've come, there are still things that are being said and how conversations are talked about now than when I was a kid. And so I'm still hearing the same kind of like things that are
what I think is really interesting, and you say that, and I'm listening to myself talking to you right now, trying to figure out how to answer or ask questions without throwing those stereotypes in or without throwing those negative words in that you had, because I would have never thought of it before. I mean, I remember growing up and making comments about people that were different and talking about it. And you made the comment in the book about parents of straight children. Did you have a discussion about their kids, about straight people? Because if that's the case, why, if they didn't have that, why do we need to go in to explain the whole idea of the LGBTQ? Because I understand it's not as common in most people's lives.
Yeah. No, these are really great questions. And I appreciate you even saying that you're kind of like trying to not,
right.
And so I appreciate that, because what I really hope my book does is that it creates a conversation. And what I don't want is, oftentimes in my own experience, when we're super hyper vigilant of not making a mistake or offending someone, we don't want to talk about it, or we don't want to say something wrong, so then we won't say anything. And I think that sometimes that can prevent really open conversations, and it can prevent maybe the needle moving a little bit. And so my hope with the book is that, like, don't have a fear of making a mistake, because wherever there's a rupture, there's an opportunity for repair.
Okay.
And so it's in the repair that we get to have like a really great conversation, and then we both walk away hopefully having learned something new.
Now, what's really interesting is I have 3 kids. My oldest is 21. I have a 17-year-old son, and I have a 14-year-old daughter. When the book came, it was sitting on my dining room table, and each kid looked at it and said, "Who's reading this?" And I said, "I was." And they looked at me and said, "Why?" And I said, "I had the interview." And I started talking to them about it. And because of their ages, they don't see anything different, because they associate with people that are of all walks of life, even with the lesbian, the gay, the bi, the transsexual, and the queer. They don't have an issue with it, which I'm thinking that is fantastic. And I'm on my way home the other night with my daughter, and we went into the whole thing. And I said, how do you identify yourself? And she goes, "I don't know. I'm 14. I'm trying to figure that out. I could be that. I could be this." And I'm thinking, okay, this just opened dialogue for me and my daughter. This is a great book, because it's a great tool making me understand where they may be coming from and helping me introduce the subject to them. And I think if that's what you were doing with the book, so far, you've done a fantastic job.
Oh, well, thank you. I mean, I'm really grateful, because even having conversations, it's interesting that you just said that, because if there was like one takeaway that I could, if I had to like get into an elevator, they say have an elevator, pitch of the book. It's
right.
It's talk to your kids. And, you mentioned your daughter's 14 and she's still figuring out. And that very well may be the case for her and a lot of other young people. there are also kids out there who do know their identity earlier. And so myself as an example, I was 6 when I first knew that there was something about me that wasn't the same as everyone else. And so for those children, and even for the kids who are still, maybe 14 and figuring themselves out, like if we can create space and allow kids, when we create the space, we allow kids to discover who they are without fear of, because in my experience of teaching, kids are, and working, I have 5 nieces and nephews. Kids are extremely insightful, they're extremely intuitive, and they pick up on the social cues, around them. And something I think is really important that we address, hopefully in this conversation, well, I'll just bring it up now, is something called heteronormativity.
Okay.
Now for your listeners who aren't familiar with that term, heteronormativity is the conscious or the subconscious, unconscious belief that being straight is kind of the normal and natural way. And the thing of it is, though, is that heteronormativity, it's like humidity. You can't really see it, but you feel it. And so you mentioned that you didn't have to think about these things when you were growing up, because with all due respect, you're a straight cisgender man. And so you navigate the world in a very different way than I navigate the world. Mm-hmm. And so I'll give you an example. Heteronormativity still shows up in my life. If I get into an Uber and the Uber driver asks me, are you married? Do you have a wife? Like, that's an example of heteronormativity. And so now the onus is on me to, this ride is only 5 minutes. Do I need to come out to him?
Right.
Like, does this really need to be a conversation? But there's a part of me that if I don't tell him, then I wonder, did I not be truthful to myself? And so that's an example of heteronormativity, is that it's constant. And over time, it adds up. And what I talk about in the book is that for someone who's LGBTQ, those experiences over time add up like scar tissue.
Okay.
And so I just want to say that, because I think that even by having conversations with young people and considering the possibility, that's countering heteronormativity.
Well, I noticed, and like I said, with reading the book, I noticed that some of the things that I've been saying, I've been trying to, I don't, like you said, don't be overprotective, but trying to be sensitive to when I say it. I did an interview last week, and I asked the individual if they were planning on marrying and if they had a partner and anything like that, because I didn't know, and I don't want to put them in a certain box. Sure. And make them feel uncomfortable about it.
Yeah. Right.
So just because I've read this, I'm starting to think, okay, just the terminology that I use could be enough to actually undermine some of these things that we're talking about.
100%. Yeah, that's a really great example. Yeah, thank you.
So again, it to me, this opens up a lot of eyes. Now, the one thing that I realized, and as I said when I read this, that previously it seemed like, and I don't like using the term movement, I don't like using that at all, because I think it sounds like a rally of some sort, but this whole idea of bringing awareness, it seemed like you were on a progressive track up until 2016, 2017, and then everything went off the rails because who went in the White House? Because of the way the population that became more emboldened about coming out against these things, because it's not that they were against it, they didn't understand it. Mm-hmm. And to them, when someone doesn't understand something, they fear it, and then they start doing that creating that type of animosity to the other people, which then creates the issues that we've been dealing with.
Right. Yeah, no, that's a really good point. And this is my belief, but the way that I saw 2016, kind of how that unfolded, is that, because I actually write about this in the book, because I remember driving in the car with a friend of mine. A coworker, we were going to teach a class. And I actually was on a PFLAG panel, one of the speaking panels that I referred to earlier. I was actually on a PFLAG speaking panel at a high school the day after the election. And I remember walking into the school here in Los Angeles and feeling, I mean, you could feel the tension in the air. And the classroom, a lot of the youth that were in this particular class were from many, many different backgrounds, multicultural backgrounds, and a lot of girls, young girls in this class. And you could see that their eyes were, you could tell that they had been crying. And so that didn't just impact the LGBTQ community. I think it impacted a lot of young people,
Right.
Because, like, to your point, I think a lot of things were kind of changing and progressing. So I share that because I remember my coworker and I, later that week, we were going to teach a class for the social emotional learning that I teach with. And I remember he was really frustrated. He was showing me this video, and it was a lot of people arguing and just politically. And I remember noticing and asking him, how old were the people in the video? And he said, 40s, 50s. And I go, exactly. So they didn't just all of a sudden start feeling the way that you're seeing. It's just now they just feel like they can say those things. And so the way that I saw the past, 6 or so years is I really saw it as an opportunity for us to kind of clean out and look at really some of the things that maybe have been laying dormant or people really haven't wanted to say out loud. And now they felt like they could say those things.
What's interesting to me, and I love the analogy in the book when you talk about asking the kids about cleaning their room cleaning it. And is the room really clean if you didn't clean under the bed?
Right.
And what you're doing right now is with the analogy is we're bringing all that stuff out from underneath the bed and addressing it.
Right.
So that's where you feel we are right now, addressing these issues that have happened because of the previous so many years.
Absolutely. 100%. You mentioned that you grew up in, I think you said the 70s, you were in high school. Yeah. So, I mean, just by virtue, one of the things I talk about in the book is an analogy I use called messages from the playground. And if I could just kind of tell you a little bit about where that comes from, and I'll connect it to what we were talking about, is that, so when I came out of the closet, I was about 25. And I knew that I was gay, but like I mentioned, I kind of had this like religious, background, not like super conservative, but just I was influenced by my religious upbringing. And so when I came out, I immersed myself in LGBTQ advocacy. In fact, that's the reason I moved out to Los Angeles, is to work for a national organization. Something though was still not, I couldn't quite put my finger on it. And even though I was doing all this work in the community, there was still a part of me that didn't fully feel okay, or I still felt maybe some shame about who I was. And so what I started to tell myself, and what helped me understand that, was that I don't know when it was, but I just suddenly kind of started to think like, oh, I played on the same playground as everyone else.
Right.
Meaning that even though I'm gay and I'm out, I still played on the same playground. And the playground is what I refer to as kind of the collective consciousness. There are certain societal beliefs collectively that dominate kind of our belief system. And so the messages are the subconscious beliefs, the things that aren't kind of the analogy of the dirty room. They're not on the surface. They're not out in the open. They're underneath the bed. And so for me, that was a way to understand the internalized homophobia that I had experienced. And I think that that's something that part of this conversation is helping us to uncover things that we're not consciously aware of, but that we're subconsciously influencing our beliefs. So if you would ask my sister back in 2015, she would have told you that she was super proud to have a gay brother, that she loved me as a gay brother. We had gone through our journey of me coming out. Her not talking to her kids though, was a subconscious belief underneath that silence that I'm referring to. And we have to look at that, because then that helps us uncover, oh, there's still part of me that believes that this is like a deviant,
right,
not child appropriate thing.
Now, the other thing I never put, it sounds really bad. I never put two and two together. But when you talk about um, being gay, being a lesbian, whatever it may be, when you
Mhm.
talk about it, there really is no, we don't know why that it happens, except we've had people try to figure out why it happened.
Yeah.
And I think one of the reasons it's been demonized is because of religion,
Mhm.
because they were trying to explain it. Then you had the medical profession, the DSM for, or the book that came out saying what mental health disorders were. And finally they're realizing that this is just this, it's what it is, there's nothing we can do about it. And the other thing that when you talk about in these camps to pray away the gay
Mhm.
is you can't change it. These people are the way they are, the same way I'm straight.
Right.
I can't change that. But why did we put such a stigma on these people? And I know why, because we didn't know about them because they were so different than we were, even though we knew people in our daily lives that were hiding it for so many years and hiding it so very well. Even the ones that did get married, did have kids, and then after a certain period of time then said, I can't do this anymore, finally did come out.
Right.
You said you were 6 years old when you knew you were gay.
Mhm.
And again, I don't like that term, but I don't like any of the terms. I just think we should say we're people. Um, you're the way you identify is the way you identify it, and I should have no concern about that whatsoever. But when you came out at 6, or you knew at 6, how did you know?
Yeah, so I get that question a lot because I think that it's challenging because the word, like you said, you don't like that word, but that word, that's what I talk about in the book, and that's connected to the subconscious beliefs. Is that words? I write a whole chapter 2 of my book. I talk about the how words are so important and they carry so much meaning. In fact, I give a exercise that is from one of my favorite teachers. Her name's Carolyn Mace, and she gives an exercise about the power of words. And she tells her audience whenever she gives a workshop that to help highlight how important words are and how words really do matter, is she says, okay, go home today, come back tomorrow, and you have to give me a word that you're never ever going to use again. And you can never use it. And so if I take that word from you, then that means that everything that you associate with that word also has to go. And so, for example, zebra. Would you be willing to never see a zebra again? Or what about the color blue? You'll never see blue again. And so she says that's her way of going through the back door to highlight how important words are. And so I use that, or I share that exercise in chapter 2 to highlight how words like gay also have that same kind of connotation, and that it's really important to like look at. And so I agree that labels aren't always good. I do though think that it's important for us because we are humans and there are differences, and differences matter. You know, differences like
Right.
hair color matters. My like, you know, like how I look, how I show up in the world, that matters to me. It's important. And so I think that by uncovering why we have certain feelings about certain words, that helps us understand, because we do live in a predominantly straight, cisgender, you know, there is such thing as male privilege, like, and
Right.
this is all tied into sexuality. And so I write about, I include gender, a whole chapter in my book about gender, because a lot of people who have some feeling strongly against what it means to be gay, that's wrapped up in with their perception of what it means to be male or female.
Right.
So it's a big conversation.
It is a big conversation, and when I was introduced to it, and it has been within the last 10 years because of my kids' friends, especially my oldest. And they would come over, and of course he didn't introduce them as my gay friend or my whatever it is. But you knew, you could tell by the actions that were being done, and I never felt any different. some of the nicest, I mean, and again, when I say it the way I say it, it sounds really bad. Some of the nicest people I ever met. Everybody's nice. I should not classify them one way or the other. But again, that's my age and that's my way of bringing up. Because again, you say we look at the differences and we focus on the differences. My issue is, because I've been doing this a long time, I've also been in the education field, I've been in the therapy field, I've done a lot of things. I don't like it when we single people out because of their differences. And that's one of the things that I have a difficulty with. And the more I read this, the more I realized that the way I use my words that I didn't think were harming anybody could harm someone that where it was in a situation that where they felt different.
Yeah.
And it makes me feel uncomfortable because my goal is not to make anybody else feel uncomfortable.
Right.
It is not to make them feel any less important than who they are or who I am.
Mm-hmm.
Just because they are different doesn't mean they're wrong. And that's the thing I'm trying to get across to everybody is we're all different by what I eat, by what I drink, by what I drive, by all that.
Yeah.
We don't have a problem with that. Why do we have a problem with this?
Yeah. Yeah. So, what I really hope and what I hope I do, and I've heard, other people reflect this back to me, but I really center children's experiences,
Okay.
with my book. And that's what I really intentionally set out to do. And so you and I are adults. And so we can talk about being different and, that person's different from me and I'm different like that's okay. Children though, young children, kids, little kids, I live right next door to a preschool. And so I always hear the kids playing in the playground and little kids that age, they want to be a part of the group. They want to be a part of something. They have an innate desire to belong. And so when they hear people described as being different, they don't want to be different. Now, teenagers, your daughter's age, she's 14.
Right.
That's a different story.
Right.
So that's why I think it's really important to be mindful of how we talk about. And so you asked me how I knew when I was 6 that I was gay. And when I share that with people, because we live in a heteronormative world, that even me saying that, like, how did you know that you were gay?
Right.
Because that's an example. Even that question is an example of heteronormativity.
Yes. Yeah.
Because the construct is such that how did you know that you know what I mean? And so that's why I share that, because and I invite people to consider, like, by even asking the question of how did you know you were gay, it's like, because straight is just kind of the natural, normal kind of thought. It's like, how did you know that you were other? And so for me, it's not that I knew that I was gay from an adult construct of the term.
Right.
It's that I knew there was something about me that wasn't being reflected in what I was seeing in the world.
Okay.
And that's why it's so important for teachers and families to start to use same-sex examples in conversations, or because then because kids just want to feel safe. They want to feel like they're safe. And so if I walk into, and I was a very hypervigilant kid, so I would walk into a room and I was constantly assessing, is this safe? Am I safe here? Also because I was aware of the fact that, even like as a kid, you often hear like, oh, Billy has a crush on Sarah.
Right.
That's just, but I've never heard, well, Billy has a crush on Tommy, because it kind of speaks to those subconscious beliefs still.
And by the way, my daughter's name is Sarah, which is kind of interesting. You pulled that one out. This guy, yeah. Anyway,
that's fun.
But that's it. So when you do these presentations and these workshops with these kids, do you get any backlash from the parents when you do that? Because I'm sure not all the parents are open enough to expose this to their children.
Sure. Yeah. So the organization I teach with is separate from the workshop that I give for specifically, how the book kind of unfolded. I just drew on my experience, but what's interesting about the organization I teach with for social emotional learning is that each student gets a journal, and then the second class, because there are 10 classes, there are 3 phases, 10 classes in each phase, and the second class of the first phase is all about beliefs, because it's a social emotional, so it's about empowerment, youth empowerment, positive thinking, positive psychology. And so we have the young people fill out, they get the journal of certain words, and what their beliefs are about those words. So like school, girls, boys, family, those kinds of things. And then we help them uncover the negative associations and then turn it into an empowerment statement. But what's interesting is that I started to bring that the program into LGBTQ spaces.
Okay.
And so what I had to start doing though is, because a lot of the curriculum was geared towards boy, girl.
Right.
It was very heteronormative. And so then we would rewrite, I would just for that particular class to be more inclusive. So for certain, like if we were doing an experiential exercise, because one of the classes talks about bullying. Mm-hmm. And so if there was a bullying scenario, and so that's just an example of, you asked about the parents. So the program I teach with isn't necessarily related to the book.
Now, we've been hearing numbers, especially during COVID, the whole lockdown and the shelter at home and everything about that we started noticing the kids were having higher rates of depression,
yes,
and anxiety.
Yeah.
Do you think some of that has to do with them figuring out who they are?
Yes.
Because they were isolated so much and they had all this time to think and be able to do it. And now they're realizing they may be different than what they thought they were before. How do we deal with that? How do we bring that up in conversation with our kids, especially parents?
Yeah, that's a really good point. That's very insightful, because so just kind of like on a side note is that I'm in a 12-step program. And so a lot of the meetings that I've been going to over the quarantine obviously were on Zoom. And I can't tell you how many, the reason I'm bringing that up is because I can't tell you how many meetings I've gone to over the quarantine that people in the meeting shared that I've had all this time and I just like I'm coming out. I just came out.
Right.
And so the reason I'm bringing that up is because I've actually heard that being the case for a lot of people, because I feel like for a lot of us this past year, almost 2 years, has been a real self-exploratory kind of, it's in many ways brought us to our knees, just with regard to changes in our lives, whether it's job or family or health. And so, so to your, yes, I absolutely believe that that's the case. And I also think that because I remember right when COVID happened, the organization I teach with, we had to do a training for mandated reporting.
Yes.
And it was a virtually online. And I remember taking a picture with my phone because I was so shocked, because the first phase or module that came up said violence, child abuse increases with job loss, isolation. It was like checking the boxes of all the things that COVID,
that we were dealing with. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And so I think that a lot of young people for sure have experienced, what it is that you're, saying as far as depression, anxiety, and maybe even some challenges coming out, because if they're locked, quarantining in a family that's not supportive.
Well, that's the other thing. You said you came from a religious background. Mm-hmm. When you came out, you said you were 25, correct?
Yes. Yeah.
So you knew it from 6 to 25 years.
Yeah.
Was your family supportive? Did they know beforehand, before you came out and said something, or were they shocked?
And I actually write about this in one of the chapters of my book, because, my mom, I really do believe, and if I could just give a shout out to parents, because parenting is no easy feat. And I really do believe, this conversation is not about pointing fingers or, saying anything like you have to do that. It's more of, I really believe that each of us is doing the best we can with
Right.
with the knowledge that we have. And so my hope is to kind of share something that has helped my own family
Mm-hmm.
to help give other families maybe a little bit something that more knowledge wise that they didn't know before. And so with that said, is I love my mom and we have a wonderful relationship. And I was very transparent with this whole book, process of writing
Right.
and sharing my personal family stories. And I always thought, and I kind of still do believe, that my mom did know.
Mm-hmm.
It's because of her maybe subconscious, just kind of not wanting to see it. Because I think that sometimes when we really don't want to see something, we kind of just don't see it.
If your mother would have asked you
Yes.
and opened that door just a little bit,
Yeah.
would you open it further, or would you just try to close it and because you weren't ready to let everybody know?
That's a really great question. And I've thought about that many, many times. And I think that, this isn't about outing any
Right.
young person when they're not ready. This isn't about pushing conversations. This is about having conversations. And so I don't think that necessarily I would have been ready if my mom did come to me and say, are you gay? Or if you're gay, I'm totally okay with that. Or,
Right.
anything like that. I think though that what I think as a young person would have helped me is for there to be a conversation and me to have felt safe.
Okay.
Meaning that sometimes when parents tell me like, oh, I've talked to my son, or I asked my son, we were having a conversation and I write about this in the book, a parent, oh, mom, you're gross. I don't want to talk about that.
Right.
That doesn't mean that we don't continue to try. I think parenting is kind of like a dance in my experience.
Okay.
Not that I'm a parent, but from what I've observed, from working with young people, from being an uncle, from having siblings with kids, it's kind of like this, you meet kids where they're at and you try a little, and then you kind of, you go and then you do, it's
Right.
kind of like
Right.
feeling it out.
Because I get where you're coming from on that, because you were probably glad that she asked, but you weren't ready to tell her anything,
Right.
which then started making it more acceptable for you to say, okay, then I can tell them soon.
Yes, exactly. And further, if I could say this, is that what I really want to help prevent with my book is the shame, because the closet experience is filled with shame. And I really break down that shame itself. Chapter 6 of my book talks about shame. And chapter 7, I get into trauma, because it's really, really important that we can help kids not experience shame, because that's what's connected to the depression and unfortunately suicide and addiction.
Now, one thing I noticed, and you said it, I said it, and everything else, but a visual that you give is this idea of being in a closet. That terminology can't be helping either, because they have to hide, because when I think of that, I think of the old saying, the skeletons that they have in their closets.
Yeah.
And we're using that terminology because it's not that the child or the individual doesn't want to face it. They just don't know how to address it to the people that they're with, and they don't want to feel excluded or isolated from that.
Yeah.
So is there a better way to remove that terminology of coming out of the closet and moving forward and using the terms that are actually happening? Because that's a term that's been used for the last 40 years.
Yeah, that's a really great point. And, I remember when before my book was actually even released, someone asked me about that he was, because we were having a conversation, I was telling him about my book, and he asked me, he's like, and he's a straight person, and he was, where did the closet, why do people use that term? And I actually didn't know. And so to your point, I think that there could be another term, because not all young people who are in the closet
Right.
aren't necessarily, for me, I really thought that because of my religious experience, I really thought that being gay was something that I could go to hell for. Like,
Right.
I really thought that. And so for me, I did try to pray the gay away, so to speak. And so for some people, it's not necessarily, that's not the case. It's more that they want to stay safe.
Okay.
And so maybe the closet isn't necessarily the best term.
It just has that negative connotation to
Sure.
it, is
Yeah.
what I'm saying.
Yeah.
And again, the words that are being used, you mentioned the book about using the term homosexual,
Mhm.
and how that has a negative connotation because it was used as a medical diagnosis,
Right.
which became a negative thing to be, because you don't talk around straight people talking about them being heterosexual,
Right.
and you don't do that, but you talk about the other people that are different
Right.
that way, and giving them that negative point of view. And how do you think we move past the terminology? Do we just say heck with the terms, use what we want to use, and just keep moving forward? Or do we try to rewrite what's being said and create a new dialogue? Because I know in the past couple of years, this gender neutral pronouns and stuff that we've talked about has actually caused, I think, a little bit more of an uproar than people thought, because they don't understand what's going on.
Yeah. 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 I mean, you bring up a lot of good points, because terms, words, that if you just kind of look through history, that's kind of how language operates. You know, terms that were maybe offensive before are then kind of reclaimed and then used, and then they kind of come back around. And so that's the case with so many words, not just with regard to the LGBTQ community. I do think that, you know, one of the things that I say in my book, and this is kind of like towards the end of my book, is that an invitation for us all, it's not to focus on keeping up, it's to focus on keeping open.
Okay.
And so, because if I get too caught up in trying to keep up, I mean, especially now, I mean, I think, I don't know about you, but time is going by so fast.
Yes.
And
yes.
I feel like even myself, like words that I would use, you know, last month are not necessarily the same anymore. And so just in my own experience. And so I always remind myself, okay, focus on keeping open, because it's in that openness that I'm able to have conversations, maybe ask questions, because also what is okay for you may not be okay for someone else.
Right.
And so this is just kind of about meeting people where they're at, and just overall trying to be a good person.
But and that's what I think is interesting, because I think we've moved so far away from being that good person that, and I think we were there at one time. I think we've moved so far away now that people like to distinguish the differences between everybody, because that makes them feel in their own mind superior to someone else. It could be sexuality, it could be color, it could be financial, it could be a lot of these things. And the way you and I are talking right now, we're both on the same playing field. We're not any different. How do we bring those other people back to the same playing field?
I think it's by having that openness. It's being willing. You know, I in my book, I broke my book up into 3 sections: willingness, or awareness, willingness, and change. And so I think it's just in that, having the awareness allows us to be willing, or invites us to be willing, then to make the change. And so to bring everyone on the same playing field, that's not necessarily my goal, is to bring you on the same playing field. My hope and my goal is to be willing to hear you, and to see you, and to meet you where you're at, and then to also share myself, and then us both walk away, maybe having learned something.
Okay. And again, that is actually probably the best way to look at it. Now, the one thing, and I will tell you this,
Mm-hmm.
I was apprehensive about the interview today.
Okay.
I really wanted to do it, looking forward to it. You and I have never met before, but I was afraid that, and again, where I'm at and the people that I work with are different. I was afraid that if I said something out of context, that you would be offended by it.
Wow.
So I was very guarded in the beginning of our conversation, because if you go back and listen or watch this, I think you can tell. But the more comfortable I got with you, the more I was willing to open up with my questions and understanding where you were coming from.
Yeah. Wow. Well, thank you for saying that, Bill, because that's really my hope. I mean, I think I even I do in the book, I talk about, I remember one of the first times I gave the messages from the playground workshop.
Right.
It was for like, 50 or so therapists and people who are really, they want to be open and, truthful. And I remember I did this exercise, and I remember the exercise did not go well because everyone was saying kind of politically correct things. And I was like, oh, this is not going well, because what I really felt like could be more powerful is if we were able to have like a really open, kind of messy conversation, because that's, again, where we get to kind of learn and grow. And so I appreciate you saying that, because it was in your willingness to have the conversation even with the discomfort that we're able to have this dialogue.
What is interesting, you use the word political correctness, and there are people out there that overthink what they're saying.
Yes.
Do you feel that's more harm than good sometimes?
I do sometimes. I know, because in my own experience, I've totally done that, where I haven't wanted to say something because I've wanted to be safe. And then it just prevents me from learning. It prevents me from it because I think a lot of us, in my own experience, like, again, the phrase messages from the playground can be applied to not just things related to LGBTQ, but it could be applied to, when I was a child, the messages that I learned about being right, so I don't want to make a mistake, because if I make a mistake, then there's some shame around that.
Right.
And so I must be dumb. And so I think that sometimes when I'm too hypervigilant and focused on being politically correct, I'm more concerned about how I look versus wanting to really learn.
Okay.
And I think that takes a certain level of humility. And I think it goes back to earlier, we talked about the rupture and repair. Because having these conversations, it's inherent that I may say something wrong.
Right.
And I say this, I've said this in a lot of the different conversations I've had since the book has come out, is that just because I wrote a book about raising LGBTQ allies doesn't mean that I'm exempt from making a mistake.
Right. I got you.
Yeah.
So, Chris, before I let you go, is there anything you want to tell my audience about the book and why you feel they need to actually pick up a copy of it?
Yes. Yeah. Thank you. That's a great question. I truly, truly believe, and this is what changed kind of after my nephew asked me that question, I realized like I have a role to play in their life more than what I thought I had. And I realized like I truly believe that we can only take others as far as we've gone ourselves.
Okay.
And so as a parent, as a caregiver, as a teacher, as an uncle, I can only take my nieces and nephews, my classmates, the people I work with on an individual one-on-one basis, as far as I've gone. So my hope with the book is to invite readers to consider this is kind of like we do the work within ourselves, and then we get to share.
Okay.
And then do the work ourselves and get to share. And that's really what's helping to change the conversation, to change the generation.
Now,
like the playground for the next generation.
Now, the one thing I want to ask you, and I did not ask you when you told me this, and I should have, but when you approached your sister with not talking to your nephew,
Mhm.
how did she take it?
Yeah, so I called her the next day, and I gently asked her, and she said, she's like, yeah, I've been wondering if I should talk to them or not. And I asked mom, and mom said, oh, Selena, they're not old enough to understand. And so, and this is my mom who loves and
Right.
supports, and so this is an example of the nuances of. And so then I remember I called my sister-in-law. It was kind of the same thing. Like,
Mhm.
I've thought about it, but I just didn't know what age.
Right.
And then again, that was another layer of nuance of, oh my gosh, they don't think that, like, there must be something deviant
Right.
still about this.
Because the one thing I've learned, the earlier you tell anybody anything,
Mhm.
the more willing they're going to be to accept it. And I
Yeah.
guarantee if they tell your 6-year-old nephew this, he's going, oh, okay. And
Yeah.
he's just going to move on. They're
Totally.
the one with the issue, not
Yeah.
him.
Yes, and
And
then
they
kids pick
don't,
that up.
yeah. And they don't, I don't know if they don't, I don't think they realize they had the issue, like you said.
Totally.
But you could tell a kid, because I've worked with them long enough, that about a certain thing. Why is this way? You tell them, they go, okay. And they
Yeah.
just keep moving on, because to them, they just wanted an answer.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
they didn't really care what the answer was. And the more you talk about it and the more open you are, the more accepting they're going to be. That's why I'm noticing right now with my kids that they are more open and more accepting than I probably was at their age, because of the way I was being raised. And again, eventually, someday, we'll all be able, well, I won't be here, but we'll all be able, or society will be able to actually coexist
Right.
without picking out the differences of every individual.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I agree. And like I mentioned before, I'm right next to a preschool,
Mhm.
and I remember a few years ago, I used to have long hair, and I wore my hair in a bun. And to your point about kids,
Mhm.
they have a thought and they ask the
Mhm.
question, not necessarily needing to know the answer, but you just give them the answer and then they move on.
Right.
But this little girl came up to the fence, and I was walking in my car, and she looked at me and she asked me, are you a boy or a girl? And it struck me, because I'm like, oh, that's an example of messages from the playground, is that I'm sure that her parents never sat her down and said, Rebecca, or whatever her name was,
Right.
boys look like this and girls look like
Mhm.
this. It's just that that's what she's picking up from the societal, just, being raised in a dominant culture. And so she saw what appeared to be a man, but with long
Right.
hair that looked like what a lot of women would wear.
Uh-huh.
So she asked the question. I told her I'm a boy, and then she continued to play.
Yeah.
And that was that. And so that's really kind of speaks to what you just shared, is that my measure for any of your listeners out there, I'll leave them with this, is that, because I get a lot of questions about, well, what age is a good age? And I always invite people to consider that if kids are old enough to ask questions, they're old enough to know the answer. So like my nephew,
right.
He's old enough to know why I wouldn't have a girlfriend.
Right. And again, that's a perfect place for us to end it. Chris, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you.
I really appreciate it. And I would love to have you back on the program again, because I think we just opened it up just a little bit, and we could go so much further down the road with this discussion, because I think there's a lot out there that needs to be discussed. But people, I don't want to use the term they are afraid to do it. I think they're apprehensive to do it.
Yeah, sure. Of course. Yeah. No, thank you. Yeah. Thank you for having me. It's been wonderful to talk to you.
Thank you very much, Chris. You have a great rest of your day.
Okay. You too. Thank you.
Well, a big thank you to Chris Tompkins for joining us today on the program. Really enjoyed that. I hope that opened your eyes as much as it opened my eyes up in this discussion about dealing with people that are perceived as being different. The name of the book again is Raising LGBTQ Allies, A Parent's Guide to Changing Messages from the Playground. Again, this is what the book looks like. I recommend it to everybody, especially those that are working with kids on a daily basis, because I don't think you realize how the words that you're using are affecting the way they perceive things. So again, Chris, thank you very much. Everybody, thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. And we'll talk to you next time here at One on One with Bill Alexander.